So this is going to be one of the most fun lives because we're going to be dealing with salt, and it's been kind of a week, and so I kind of am very excited to get lost in some textures here. This is a zero consequence painting, but timing is everything. So I'm just going to start with some stuff really quick, and I'm going to dry it off. If you have a blow dryer or hair dryer at home, that's really great. I have a little like space heater with a cat next to it, so I'm going to be tossing this there just so you don't have to wait too long. But just got to start off really fast with a touch of blue, and we're going to fill in this and this just to let it dry, and then I'll talk salt. We'll talk about salt. So I'm just going to add a touch of blue right up here. This is not the sky. This is actually the base of kind of a snowy mountain, I'm thinking. But I'm just adding a little bit right there just to have it in right now, and then our green right down here. You can see same color as these other paintings I made, and I'm just kind of getting this in because the salt takes a little while to dry, and I made some examples, it's worth coming up with a game plan. Whenever it comes to adding other stuff to your watercolor, it's worth kind of looking before you leap, so to speak. Touch of dark blue into my green, just kind of color matching a little bit. And if you're struggling to catch up, that's totally fine because I'm about to talk salt at you for a little while. So there we go. That's what I just needed. Get those two drying. I'm going to toss them by the cat. So if you see some extra hair in my painting, that's what's going on. And let that dry off. Now, salt. This right here is a little bit of some table salt. We have very fancy salt that my wife loves. I was not allowed to grab that, but that's okay. You're kind of looking in salt for something kind of like this. It's it's not like powdered and it's not super super thick salt. I've tried a lot of these. Some of them, like the really extreme big thick grains that almost look like tiny rocks or flakiness, that can really affect things in kind of a wild way. So I find that just the basic salt kind of works the best. This is pink Himalayan salt from Costco because that's what we get here in Alaska. Whatever's in bulk. Now, this is a little example of what happens when you add salt. These are a few swatches. This is salt added to a super wet painting. This is to a medium, and this is to almost dry. And if you look real close, basically put this right into the camera lens, still has the salt on there. You can see the salt soaks up the pigment. So it's not repelling it, it's actually kind of soaking it up. So you can see these differences between these is actually pretty extreme. And that's why it's worth having a bit of a game plan because you want to get the texture you're looking for. And as your paint dries, these are probably a minute apart, maybe 2 minutes apart. It is going to make a huge difference. So this was basically I put the paper down, put the paint on, and then immediately sprinkle the salt on. This is kind of in the middle, and then this in the end. But what you do once it's totally dry, you gotta wait till it's kind of bone dry. Then you can scrape all this salt off. So I'm going to go do that right now. So do I have a? Oh, actually, this is perfect. I'll just do it into a trail tin. Right here, once you scrape your salt off, you actually can kind of see the textures below. You're not going to hurt the paper too much, but if you're worried, you can always do this with an eraser. But that's why you kind of wait till it's very dry. And you're never going to quite know exactly how dry it is until like you're over sure, because a lot of times like water in rocky tide pools or something, the water will hide below the salt. You don't want that to happen too much. Still getting a little bit of texture on this first one, but the rest of these are in good shape. And there you go. Look at this. That like kind of I can't even focus. There you go. So that salt is now kind of purplish because it's soaked up all that indigo that I put there. So here is the finished salt. You can see we got some really wild, almost feathery techniques here. This is about maybe 45 seconds of drying when I put it on. You can see this one has some really interesting, almost texture patterns. And then this is when it was basically almost dry and I still put some salt on. This one, you kind of have something that's a bit more cracked, a bit more spackly. I want something kind of around these two, sort of what I'm looking for. So I'm going to make sure it's on while it's still pretty wet, but I might let it dry just a touch. That's pretty cool. But we're going to be doing some really fun textures on our two mountains, and you could try both. Why not? Give it a go. So I should have this one being dry. We are in good shape there. And let's go add some paint and salt. Now, there's a lot of other things you can do too, but when it comes to painting with salt, I would make sure you basically put your pigment down and then you leave it alone because if you kind of mix it around, you'll dissolve the salt. And you can paint with salt water, but the texture happens when it's salt on top of paint. You don't want to put paint on top of salt necessarily. So we're going to add our first layer here. I'm thinking this brown one. I'm just going to mix up some colors for myself. A little bit of brown, a little bit of probably some purple in there as well, just for fun. Oh, right, there's the purple right here. I forgot about this one. What do I do here? Well, maybe I'll add in this afterwards. I'll do this middle layer and then I'll add in some purple afterwards. So here we go, a little bit of brown, just working real simple, just normal layers. We've done this 1,000 times before. But what I'm gonna work on is as soon as that paint consistency is right, that is when I'm gonna pounce. Really add a ton, well, not a ton, add the brave amount of salt right off the bat. So here we go. Just kind of color mixing just a little bit right up here. I love working with kind of things like this because it just takes me right out of the painting. This week has been one where I've been overthinking everything, and I need some purple now. I just love when you can kind of get lost in the layers, and painting is kind of like running. The first couple times you do it, you're just thinking and coordinating, and it's a little stressful, but eventually your body knows what to do, and you can just kind of relax into it and just focus on the motions and the breathing, and that is my favorite part. So this is just so like that where it's like, okay, just one little piece at a time. And that's kind of how this month and year is going to. Just one little piece at a time, and we'll see where it goes from there. All right. A little bit of water here just to kind of get that nice smooth kind of bloom at the end. Just like that, and keep an eye on where that is. I'm going to wait till exactly the right moment. This is about how wet that first initial salting was, if you remember from that sheet. So if you want, you can absolutely just start throwing salt on already. I'm probably going to wait just a couple seconds, and then I'm going to add that one on. But just for a reminder, here is like no time. Here's a little bit of time. Actually, maybe I'll go with no time. Let's give that a shot. Kind of get a little bit more fluid, a little less detail. Kind of would be fun. So here is a little pinch of salt. I would say less is more. If you really cover it, it's a cool effect, but if you can just add a little bit like this, and here we go, just sprinkling it on. The cool thing is you don't need to worry too much about getting it like exactly in the lines because whatever dries is gonna stick, and whatever doesn't catch is just gonna you'll be able to brush it right off. It's just it's like yeah, just well, it's like salt. It's like just putting salt on paintings. There we go. A little bit of salt right there. On the big paintings, I would advise kind of really choosing the layer you want because you don't want tons of detail everywhere. So, whether it's one layer or just one piece of a layer, especially in areas with good contrast, is really going to stand out. So here we go. That's what it looks like. I'm going to go dry it off next to the cat here in a second. A little bit of salt, and you can see it kind of soaked up some of that pigment already, but the magic happens in a second or two. So turning that heater up, getting that going. And you will notice like a lot of things like this. I mean, watercolor is all about those textures, right? So these blooms are very similar to what you're going to see within this salt texture. And that's because it's all kind of doing the same stuff. If you can imagine watercolor, which is, it's pigment sort of suspended in something that helps it move a little bit better. It's almost like if you imagine a bunch of glitter. If you put a bunch of glitter in a bath, it's gonna flow all over the place. And if you let that bath sit for long enough, or eventually dry out, the glitter will settle probably mostly toward the lower part of the bath near the drain. And that's kind of what watercolor is. So this pigment is suspended, and then In this case, where it's bloom, I put this water and it kind of pushed it all out and then dried and kind of locked itself in. And with salt, what's going on is you got all this pigment and the salt is actually sucking up. I think it's sucking up that water. Um, with like all those little, I don't know the chemistry, but something about ions or something. If you're a chemist, you can let me know. But the salt is moving all of that water toward it, and that kind of like a bathtub draining with glitter is going to either pull in all that pigment and make it disappear, or it's going to kind of push it around. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of the chemistry behind it, which sometimes helps, sometimes doesn't. But ultimately, that everything you do, aside from putting the stuff on the ground itself, you can just imagine the it's the science behind watercolor. You don't need to know it, but it is why it's happening. It's kind of this cool thing because those same processes happen in rivers, they happen on beaches, they happen really everywhere. And it's just cool because it's all connected there. Okay, so we're gonna check what's going on with the salt. I might need to wait just a moment or two more with it. But in the meantime, if you want to see what's going on with the cat, let me go show you a quick cameo because it's live and I can do that. This is Charlemagne. He is the studio cat. Oh, let's see, it's not focusing too well. And then way back there, let's see if I can make this. Way back there, you can see my painting next to the heater. He basically sits here and roasts himself most of the day, but he's not quite done roasting yet, which is amazing because he's kind of been on a slow cooker for about 7 years now. Very cozy. Okay, so I'm going to grab that in just a moment. Hopefully it is a little closer. This is kind of a funny live because just the scope of what we're working with just naturally takes some time. So if you do have any questions, definitely let me know. I can answer those now, but also this is kind of why I often like to do 2 or 3 paintings at once. You just have some time. It does mean though, if you're working in the field with salt, just be totally aware of that. It can take a while and kind of throw things off, and you can't really close the book afterwards either because that salt will be still wet. Okay, just quick checkup now. You can see, look at what's happening. We're getting those really interesting kind of rings around the salt. And that is getting super cool, especially these ones down here, very kind of pronounced. Now the rest of this actually feels pretty dry. So what I might do is continue on, just making sure any little salt grains are pushed away, and just tape it down here. And so the next one, I'm going to get really dark. And this is where it's going to be kind of interesting because this right down here is going to be a much darker layer. We got some of the indigo and that purple, and that is where that salt really will kind of shine through. So let's work on these next 2 layers. I'll probably ignore this one, not put some salt on it, but then this one right here, I'm really going to go haywild. So here we go, round 2. This is feeling a little bit more like this version. Something in this one, I'm really going to put it on and then immediately salt it up. A little bit of indigo. Maybe I'll toss in a touch of blue. Right there. With watercolor, everything will dry lighter, kind of like a beach pebble. And with salt, that just kind of gets magnified. So you can afford to go a little bit darker if you're going to be adding some salt, because you're going to lose some of that naturally to the salt itself. It kind of eats up that pigment. Being real careful-ish, sticking within the lines. And here goes that. All right, still wet. And then immediately some salt right in there. Just making sure I get it into the fun spots. I'm going to go a little bit heavier on this one just because I want to. The danger of putting a ton of salt on while it's still super wet is sometimes it kind of dissolves and you actually get these really kind of crusty bits that are almost like stuck to the paper. It's more like you made cement than you created something. So you can go too light and you can go too dark on both ends of the spectrum. While we're doing this too, I'm going to add in a touch of that purple just up top, this is a series, so I've got to keep it relatively even, but it doesn't matter too much. A little bit of that purple, just like that. I've had a lot of experience painting with, cold things and putting gin in water, but this summer was one of the first times I started painting with salt water, just because I didn't have any. I was on the beach, and I was pretty impressed. It really acts a lot like water. I think it could make maybe your paint last not, 200 years. Maybe it only lasts 150 or something like that. But makes me wonder too how salt water would react to paintings like that in the future. Okay, a little bit right there. And I'm gonna go toss that back next to the cat, and we'll see how all of this turns out in just a couple seconds. Checking for some questions as well. Not too many questions, but I will say that one of the things I'm really loving is seeing all of these exist. It is so cool to see different interpretations of all of these. I often say it, new to watercolors are the same, but especially when you do something like salt. I mean, that is one in a trillion, not just one in a billion, because that is those little tiny random actions. But also, it's so cool seeing people's styles come through. And maybe you're somebody who does a lot of tutorials, maybe you're somebody who's just kind of starting, or you're an expert. But I will say, seeing people's style is so awesome. And I was so worried about that when I was, younger. I would make a painting, say like this, or let's see, where's the whales? I'd make I'd make something like some bears, and it wouldn't look exactly like the other artists' bears that I was, inspired by, and I'd feel so far back, maybe. But eventually, I'd keep on painting the same things, and my bears never really changed. I never became that other artist, but I began to love those little styles, those little tiny patterns that form naturally in my own stuff. And so it's really cool seeing a lot of these out there, but also your style is cool and your landscapes and wherever you are from is cool. And so if doing this kind of feels like being on training wheels with a bike a little bit, sometimes you need somebody to hold your hand. But if you can do this, you can do anything. And I totally suggest making a little trace, maybe taking a picture, and you can trace from that picture. But try out some of these techniques on landscapes in your own backyard, on pets, instead of a whale or a bear, or whatever you find to be really exciting, because that leap from following a tutorial to actually being an artist is so much smaller than you would think. And maybe it feels like you're doing things different. You still have something to learn, but to be honest, you might just be living in your own style. And when you start to take that style to the places around you, boom, you are there. So kind of fun to see that in other people as well. Because I'm lucky enough that I'm finally seeing this now with myself after 25 years of painting. But yeah, it's cool stuff. The world is so inspiring out there, and sometimes you just need a couple little techniques to get there. All right, back to that painting. Let's see if it's dry yet. Now this is kind of interesting. I think this might not have changed almost at all. You can still see that salt is there. It's still pretty wet, but it looks like there's just like little pebbles on it. Now this is the point where you might be tempted to scrape it off. Don't do it yet. You can still see those little dark motes around. That means that it is still very wet below there and it still has some drying to do. So if you were to scrape those off right now, it would more or less just kind of smear all over the fact. So you wouldn't get the cool salt and you wouldn't get a clean brush stroke. So that is that middle ground you really want to avoid, and why I say it's worth just letting it go full bone dry if you can. All right, back by the cat. But yeah, it's been an interesting week for sure, and makes me really appreciate being able to dive into a lot of this with an amazing community. Somebody described it a little bit as the only way that they were able to breathe was because of art, and I appreciate that. Having painted a lot of watery things, I appreciate that because I often feel like art is like a scuba tank. It lets me go into wild worlds that I never would be able to, but it also kind of keeps me from drowning, especially in times like this. And when you can kind of focus on these little things, whether you're giving it to somebody or or just kind of taking life one brushstroke at a time, uh, is really important to not stop painting. Even if the most stressful thing in your life is making the art, if you can just do something and create something, you're still moving forward and you're moving forward through it. So that's how I felt a little bit with some of these, where it was like, okay, where are we going with this? But eventually you will see even the smallest picture, like something like this, becomes a really integral part of that big picture. If it was missing, it wouldn't feel complete. And it's kind of the same thing with times like, these. The tough times, the bad time, whatever it is, they are still vital parts of that big picture. And without all of it, you don't really see that. Unfortunately, you kind of have to finish that big picture to really appreciate it and look back. At least that's what I'm telling myself. Okay. Gonna check, see if there's any questions really quick. Not too many. Oh, one, let's see. Do you find salt works better the granulated and non-granulated pigments? Right. Okay. So we were talking about granulated pigments the other day, things like moon glow, which maybe I have an example. No, I don't. But moon glow is kind of some interesting granulated pigments. You absolutely can use salt on some granulating pigments. If you've seen them before, they're kind of like well, it's almost like two-tone, crackly. It's like Rococo pottery, or raku, but in watercolor. And you totally can use salt on them, but it's almost like adding another variable. With algebra, it's solve for x, but as soon as you add salt to something like granulating pigments, it's now solve for x and y. So it's just a little harder to get that equation right, but it does look pretty cool. You're just throwing an extra wrench in there. Other cool things to kind of add with salts could be things like mask. So you could make a painting. Say you're painting, oh, I don't know, what do I have here? A squash. So you're painting a squash and you add, say, a really cool layer, but you just want some interesting salts effect right here. You can put mask or even masking tape and you can kind of hide the rest of the painting. And then you could paint in that really dark layer or whatever you want and add just salt right there. So you can absolutely granulating pigments. They're really fun. Try all the textures, but also the coolest stuff is just maybe adding a little accent of something new, like salt. You never know. If you just put just a touch of salt in one place, it makes it look so much more on purpose and wild and crazy. And that's just a really fun way to kind of improve upon what might seem like a simple sketch. Just kind of makes it complex. It's like adding a garnish. It was a good meal, but you add that parsley, boom, now it's a fancy meal. Okay, we're gonna give this a go. I think it should be dry-ish now, but this is just kind of a really quick sketch, so it's worth testing. Got my little tin here. I'm going to give it little scrapings to see what happens here. So here's this top layer. And I think everything feels pretty dry. The problem is by the time you realize it doesn't feel dry, it's kind of too late. The reason I'm not just like letting this wait for a whole day is because, it's alive. It's fun to see what you can do in 30 minutes or so. Just using a finger here, a dry one. If you got a wet finger, that could be a little bit of an issue. There we go. Okay, so here is layer number one. Let's see how this looks. That is pretty cool. What's so fun with salt is, try to do that on your own. That would take you months for all those little tiny squiggles and details, especially if you're gonna blow up a painting for like a Christmas card or something. Really fun texture. And it works mostly, I'm seeing, in this kind of layer between purple and brown. The brown ones, they exist, but they're not too they're not too noticeable. I think salt does do different things with different kinds of pigments. Now, in this case, is indigo, which apparently did close to nothing. I don't know what happened here, but it could be I was maybe using a different indigo. When I see here, oh yes, this is what's going on. I was talking earlier about the danger of adding a little bit of salt to something with too much pigment sometimes. You can let it dry fully, but sometimes it kind of locks itself in. And yep, there we go. This is the result. Here's me doing some of the learning for you. it kind of sticks almost like a little barnacle, or like moreover a barnacle that's been removed. Still an interesting look, but not quite the kind of fluffy, wild, feathery texture I was going for. But that's okay. With these things, if you're having fun, it counts, and it's a really good learning moment. Honestly, I should think now that I look back at it, this right here is not indigo. This is kind of a Payne's gray. I think I made it from a different palette, so whatever that color is. So perhaps there is a difference between indigo and Payne's gray, and probably why it's worth testing out some of these things just to see how they react. I mean, that was almost no reaction compared to this one. So still should work out pretty well. Here is the final results just to see how they all stick together. Perfect. What's nice with these, as long as the loose values line up with this whole series, it's going to look pretty good and work out pretty well. But if you can learn something along the way, that's great. And if you can find some textures like this, I absolutely love. I'm adoring this. Then you are so much further along. So the next one we're going to do is, believe it or not, one more little painting right here of the mountains before we kind of start to cruise back down. And then that final layer is where we're really going to finish everything up in a pretty wild way. But if you have any questions, definitely reach out, check out the website, and then please, if you get a chance, subscribe to the newsletter, which you're probably already on. But if you don't, we have some really fun ideas that we're thinking about making just something that's a little bit more personal. And I can't wait to be able to share more about the slightly different thing that we're going to do with this one next time. But you'll find that out through the newsletter. So thank you so much for painting along, and I can't wait to see how your salt paintings turned out. Please send them over and share them. They are going to be so unique. I guarantee it. There's no way you can make the same thing twice with watercolor, but then when you add salt, that is something absolutely one of a kind that you just made right there.